One of the key tasks of, going from adolescence to an adulthood, or one of the things that we're supposed to achieve by the time we're adults, is to become self-governing. So this means to be able to make your own decisions and your own choices, to lead your own life. When we're talking about these ideas, a lot of it comes down to autonomy. But I want to make it super clear that autonomy is not the same thing as independence. They're related constructs, but they're not the same thing. Independence, here this is our operational definition, is the capacity to behave on one's own. Like you're making your own decisions, but this is like, do I want to leave the house right now or not? Do I want to engage in sexual behaviors with this partner or not? This is part of autonomy, but autonomy is a broader term. Autonomy isn't just acting independently, but also feeling independent and thinking for oneself. So autonomy has three parts. There's emotional autonomy, behavioral autonomy, and cognitive autonomy. And I'm going to talk about each of those in just a little bit. But first, I'm going to talk about why autonomy is an adolescent issue. Like identity, autonomy is also a lifespan issue. It's not just an adolescent issue. You can imagine that we talked about toddlers already, about this time of the terrible twos and the terrible threes. And again, not that those are experienced cross-culturally, but terrible twos and terrible threes, it's about I want to do what I want to do, what I want to do it. This is a question of autonomy. If we're talking about the elderly, autonomy is also an issue. Think about when grandma or grandpa gets their license taken away from them, or they're no longer able to lead independent lives. That's a question of autonomy. But autonomy is huge in adolescence. We're going to relate it back to those three fundamental changes: puberty or biological changes, cognitive changes, and social changes. You can see how those fundamental changes are affecting autonomy development. For puberty, or the biological approach, the idea that has been posed is that we're moving towards peers and away from parents. Partly that's because of hormones. This is an evolutionary perspective, so this is more of a theoretical approach than an empirically science-based, we can test this in the lab approach. But the idea here is that hormones are setting us up, so we're getting ready to mate, to leave home. Leaving home means that you're more autonomous. Similarly, puberty also, recall, leads us to look different. And so just by having these changes in physical appearance, this should sound familiar as it related to identity, means that we're expecting more independence. We look older. We feel like we should have more responsibility, or we should have the ability to make our own decisions. So these are two ways in which puberty or pubertal changes can affect the way that we see ourselves, but also affect our behavior as it relates to autonomy. As for cognitive changes, we need to be able to engage in decision making. Recall that the changes that are taking place in the adolescent brain are all about decision making. In fact, their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until our early 20s. The ability to consider other people's perspectives and weigh their opinions, and how that ultimately affects our decision-making skills. Being able to think about the future in different ways allows us to weigh pros and cons of our decisions in ways that we can't necessarily do in childhood. So because of all of these cognitive changes, they're allowing us to make our own decisions for ourselves in ways that we couldn't do earlier in our lives. For social changes, or rights, roles, and responsibilities, these new rights, roles, and responsibilities are giving us new responsibility and self-reliance. So things like getting a job or getting a driver's license are inherently all about autonomy. We are by ourselves for the first time. This is related to decision making, and we are able to have that independence. So inherently, those go hand in hand. as I've already mentioned, there are three subtypes of autonomy, and we're going to talk about each of those in this order: emotional autonomy, behavioral autonomy, and cognitive autonomy. Emotional autonomy is a construct that I've studied in my own research. I find this area of autonomy particularly compelling because we do see a huge developmental transition around the period of the transition from high school to college for many adolescents. Emotional autonomy is this idea that you are seeing yourself as emotionally independent from your parents. So this is about the change in close relationships, especially with parents, but we are less emotionally dependent on them if you have emotional autonomy. So what does this look like? This means that you don't rush to parents when upset, worried, or you need assistance in some way, at least not all of the time. You don't need them to regulate your own emotions. Similarly, there is a cognitive component that you don't see parents as all-knowing or all-powerful. So what I mean by this is that maybe you're trying to make some kind of decision. You're like, I have to ask my parents first. But is it the case that your parents are actually experts on this area? Is this a topic that you should be figuring out on your own? Is this a topic that you should be reaching out to other people who actually are experts? So let's say a medical doctor or one of your professors. So essentially, it's being able to realize that parents are imperfect people, as we all are, and that we need to be able to become not necessarily separated from them, or it's just the relationship is transformed. By the time we're older adolescents, we should also be able to see our parents as people and not just as parents. This is related to again, we're all imperfect, but that, we're all leading our own lives. We're all flawed. We all have similar emotions and motivations. So taken together as a whole, individuals who are higher in emotional autonomy are able to separate themselves from their parents. And it's not, again, to just never go to your parents if you have issues. That's not necessarily healthy either. But you have to go to parents for everything, for approval, for help. And we see big changes in this when I studied helicopter parenting from times past, because parents are always connected to us via our phones. And I may have mentioned this in class before at some point, but somebody has coined the term or said that cell phones are like the electronic umbilical cord, where we're always connected to our parents. And in my own research, I'm interested in understanding how does this technology affect the development of emotional autonomy, which is a key skill in order to be functional adults. Again, there are lots of individual differences. Behavioral autonomy is, as I've already mentioned, more along the line of independence or decision making. It's our capacity to make independent decisions and actually follow through on them. So this is the behavioral component. There are some interesting findings on what we know about the developmental transitions of behavioral autonomy. So there are two here that I'm going to talk about. One is that in early adolescence, when we're trying to make decisions, we're really more drawn to the benefits over the consequences. This is related to areas of our brain that have to do with reward sensitivity. So when we're trying to make a decision, we aren't weighing them equally, the pros and the cons, or the benefits and the consequences. But as we get older, this immediate rewards effect declines. And ultimately, that allows us to make better, more rational decisions. I'm not saying that we're perfect at this. I'm not saying that everyone is the same. But we do see a developmental transition where the rewards aren't necessarily as salient or clouding our vision. Another big change that happens developmentally is related to things we've already talked about related to the prefrontal cortex. That's still developing. The prefrontal cortex is also related to our ability to control impulses. If we're able to control impulses, we're often able to make better decisions because we're thinking about it more clearly, more thoroughly, more rationally. So because of these changes that are happening cognitively, these are affecting our decision-making skills. And by the end of adolescence, we should be able to make better decisions than we could have earlier in adolescence. This is the last slide for this lecture and the last slide for autonomy. So the third part of autonomy or third aspect of autonomy we're going to talk about is cognitive autonomy. And what this means is that we are supposed to, by the end of adolescence, ideally, develop our own independent beliefs, opinions, and values. When we are going through adolescence, remember that we are able to think in more advanced ways. We can think in ways that are hypothetical, this if-then thinking about different personalities, thinking about the future, and engage in metacognition or just thinking about thinking in general. Through adolescence, we learned that parents aren't, all-knowing, that they're imperfect, that what they may have told us at earlier points in times or in history isn't necessarily reflective of what we think or believe or know to be true. And we may question their ideas and values that maybe we accepted as children. This is related to one of those fundamental cognitive changes that again, we start to question what our parents always told us, and maybe there are gray areas. Eventually, as we go through adolescence, and some of these changes aren't taking place until late adolescence and even into one's early 20s and potentially even later than that. Not to say that autonomy is stopping in adolescence. We've already talked about how it is a lifespan issue. But our beliefs become founded in our own values. We can talk about our moral beliefs, what we believe to be ethically, passable or not. Our political beliefs, our religious issues. What I want to be super clear on is that this is supposed to be a time of questioning. So if perhaps your parents were, raising you to have certain religious beliefs, and you still have those same religious beliefs today, that is fine and great, and you can still be scoring high on cognitive autonomy as long as you have questioned those beliefs and thought about those beliefs and decided if those were your beliefs and not just what somebody told you. That's going to be the same thing for our political beliefs or our moral beliefs. So it's in the end, if you have the same belief system as parents who raised you with that belief system, that is not problematic in any way, as long as you went through this process of exploration and questioning, experimentation, at least in terms of your ideas, to decide what's really what you believe. If you have these clear ideas of what you believe, then you have cognitive autonomy. That's all we have for the lecture today. I hope you learned a lot about identity autonomy. These are two of my favorite topics and ones I've studied in my own research, at least to some extent. And I will see you next time.